So now we can really begin to refine our sketch, where we ultimately want to achieve a clean tracing before transferring our final design to final paper. This is also a great time to make any final adjustments to our lettering or our angles in our letter forms. So we're going to start by throwing the tracing paper right on top of my drawing. I will tape it on because I'm working on an angle. And the first step in this process is actually throwing those guidelines back down. So for me, I will be throwing down, and for you guys, that baseline, that cap height, and that X height, that height of those lowercase letters. Additionally, I will throw in my angles. So these are the angles of the angles in which my letters are leaning. There's no real rhyme or reason to where or why I'm placing them where I am. I'm just throwing them straight across the word. So now I'll go in here and actually start tracing what's beneath. Again, I think it's more important that you draw natural feeling curves than it is to trace what's directly below. As always, this isn't intended to be a super clean process. There is still mess ups involved. So in this situation, I see that my G is a little bit further to the left of my R than I want it to be. So I'm actually going to slightly adjust my tracing paper, being sure that my baseline still align with what's below. Get my G placed where I want it to in relation to that R, and start drawing again. As we discussed before, those circular letter forms dip slightly below that baseline. So you can see the curve of my T here, that curve of my A, of my R, of my G. They all dip slightly below that baseline. We're having a lot of fun, aren't we? So I'm just going to continue working through this until I fully trace the entire word. Again, it's okay if you guys have to erase in this step. I don't want you to feel like any step in this process ever is precious. So now that I have my final trace pencil sketch, I will pull that off and see how it looks. I see I forgot my crossbar of my T. It's no problem, I can just simply add that in. So now we're going to move on to what I call the circle test. Basically what we're going to do is draw a little circle that tests the width of each letter. We want them all to be as similar as possible. So I'm going to start off on the letter R. What I see actually here is my R isn't quite as thick as I want it to be. So I'll add a little bit of additional weight and then come in and draw my circle. So I'm now going to move this circle across to every vertical stroke within my letters. You can see here that the circle is a little bit wider than my A. So I'll actually come in and add a little bit of additional weight within my A. It's a little bit more accurate. I'm going to cross to my vertical stem in my A, maybe add a bit of additional weight. It's not imperative that this is exactly the same width of every letter, but it is a great reference point to get started. My T feels right. E maybe a bit thin. The F gets a little bit thick at the top, but I like that because there is a lot of negative space here, so I'm okay with this getting a little bit thicker. Feels okay. The U feels all right. My L maybe needs a little bit of weight. A final thing I want you guys to see in this process is that the terminals, or the ending of my strokes, are all very similar. So you can see my L, my F, my T, my A, my U's, they all have a very similar shape. So that's treated the same as serifs, where you want to have a very similar top and bottom of your letters. So I want you guys to feel comfortable tracing this as many times as you need. Oftentimes I'll do this step 3, 4, maybe even 5 times. What's important is that you feel comfortable with where things are. You have consistent spacing. You want that consistent rhythm and balance throughout your lettering, and you want to have those consistent line weights. This current sketch, I'm happy with where it's going, but it isn't quite the crisp, clean line quality that I wanted. So I actually did an additional sketch where I traced directly over top of this grateful tracing. This enabled me to move and adjust some of my letters a little bit, whether I was opening or closing some of my spacing. In addition, I was able to be sure that I was continuing to find those similarities in my letter forms. So my E and my A shape being similar, and these vertical strokes in my T, F, and L all being similar. So because our next step is the transferring phase, we want to be sure that our sketch or our trace is as refined and crisp as possible. We want this to be essentially exactly how we want it to look on our inked final piece. So refine and refine as many times as you think is necessary before you actually transfer. So as we get started with this transferring step, what I want you guys to do is grab a pencil and actually get the tip nice and worn down. So I'm going to start by taking my pencil. There's no rhyme or reason to what I'm doing here, really just getting the tip a little bit more dull. So just focusing on getting a duller tip on my pencil, and that's about where I want it to be. Nice and dull, no sharp edges. What this enables us to do is put a solid layer of graphite on the back of our initial tracing, and that way we can then do a solid transfer. So I will then take that refined sketch that we have done, or that refined tracing. I'm gonna flip it upside down, and then holding my pencil at about a 45-degree angle, I'm gonna put that solid fill, loose and rough, across the entire back of my paper. It doesn't need to be anything too dark or too heavy, but you wanna be sure that you cover all of your letters. So I'll set that aside for the moment, and next I'll pull in my final sheet of paper. So when you're actually selecting a final sheet of paper for your drawing, there's numerous options. You could use a piece of printer paper, but the problem with that is that the fibers in that paper are actually pretty loose, and therefore when you're actually putting your ink on your paper, the ink might actually start to bleed. When you use something like bristle board or an artist paper, the fibers are a lot more densely packed, and therefore you have much less tendency for the ink to bleed. I'm going to start by finding the center of my final paper, simply by measuring and drawing a crosshair. So this is 12 inches across. So I will draw a line in at about 6 inches. 9 inches, so at about 4.5, or exactly 4.5, because math is good to me. Draw my crosshair. I will pull my initial sketch back up, and I will find very loosely, this is more of a guesstimate, if you will. I'm trying to find where the center of my word grateful is. Visually, I'm gonna throw it kind of right in the middle of my T. So I'm actually gonna take that crosshair on my grateful and line it up with the crosshair on my final paper. Make sure things look level. So now that my tracing paper is taped down on top of my final, I see my crosshair here lines up rather nicely with the crosshair in the center of my final paper. So at this point, I'm actually going to add an additional piece of tape just to be sure things aren't shifting around when I'm drawing. And now what I'm going to do is simply draw directly on top of this trace drawing that we've already created. Again, at this point, our tracing is basically as final as we want it to be. Right now, there's no room for second guessing what we've already done. We just want to trace directly what we've already drawn so that the transfer onto the final paper is exactly what we see. So I'm quite literally drawing exactly what I see on my paper. The graphite that is on the back of this tracing paper will transfer directly on to our final sheet. So as you're tracing, the amount of pressure that you apply, it might be slightly more than what you would if you were normally drawing, but it doesn't need to be anything ridiculous. Oftentimes when tracing like this, I find that going super slow might feel intuitive. However, if you go a little bit faster, you're able to achieve a little bit more natural curves in your letter forms. I love the purr of graphite on a nice slice of tracing paper. It's possible that as you're tracing, you might go a little bit outside of one of your lines. It's totally fine. Yes, it will transfer that graphite onto your final paper. However, we can ultimately erase that in the end. So as you're going through, if you feel like there's any particular letters or areas of your letters that you missed, I would recommend just going back over that area. There's no harm in going over areas twice. But you can also simply untape the bottom half of your drawing, lift things up. I see that I've missed most of my F, so I can just lay it back down. Make things are lined back up where they initially were, and come back in and finish my letter. Take another peek. So as you can see, that little imperfection of my F did actually transfer, but as I mentioned, it's no big deal. We can just get in there and erase that. So our next step is inking. That's the final step. So if you have any last minute tweaks or changes to make, now is your last chance. So I'm going to go in here and add a little bit of extra volume to my E. I wasn't really a fan of the space left between that E and that F. And lastly, I see that my L doesn't come quite down to the baseline, so I'm going to tweak that a bit. So take your time here to be sure that this final sketch is really what you want it to be, because we're moving on to the Sharpies and pens next, and that's our final phase.